Have you ever thought about how a time of very high wealth in the 1920s could lead to the worst economic downturn in modern history? The Great Depression didn't happen suddenly. It was a combination of economic policies, international debts, and excessive buying and selling that eventually caused the crash of 1929. Come with us as we uncover the series of events that caused the world to feel hopeless, look at the impact on many people losing their jobs and having very little money, and study the important role of leaders like Franklin D. Roosevelt in shaping the efforts to recover from this. The Great Depression was one of the worst disasters in world history that led millions of people to become paupers. In America, men and women would be queuing for bread and living in tents and shacks. In Germany, the effects of the Great Depression were catastrophic as it paved the way for the Third Reich and the beginning of the Second World War. Society continues to enjoy the glamour of the 1920s as a time of parties and jazz. But it was in these years that the Great Depression was sown. While the stock market crash of 1929 is considered as the beginning of the Great Depression in the US, it was not the only factor that led to the disaster. In Europe, in the early 20s, the economy was already in shambles and the situation was not improving. Many countries in Europe were unable to repay the debts incurred to America during the First World War. Germany was among those that were paying huge reparations. Germany was in hyperinflation by 1922, as their money was becoming virtually worthless. People carried wages in wheelbarrows, and people resorted to burning money to keep warm. The value of 1 trillion German marks was equivalent to $1 in 1923, and the lowest point of the German currency. Germany's unstable economy was revived by a currency reform and the Dawes Plan, which eased some of the reparations that Germany had to make. However, it was not sufficient to avert the emergence of the far right in the 1920s. In the US, on the other hand, the economy was on the rise and the country was enjoying the benefits of the New World Order. Purchases were stimulated by the constant reduction of taxes, wages increased, and consumerism was promoted. The automobile was a huge boost to the American economy, as it created factory jobs and jobs for construction of roads and petrol stations. The car revolutionized America's geography, and many people could now travel longer distances in search of employment. Many older industries also benefited from car manufacturing, as many factory bosses copied Henry Ford's brilliant assembly line model to mass-produce goods. For the upper class, new inventions such as the radio and washing machines became fashionable consumer goods. Some people purchased new gadgets on credit, which was not a wise decision. That would cost them later. This decade was remarkable for New York, where Wall Street was working at full speed. The Empire State Building and Rockefeller Center were constructed in this period, and a forest of skyscrapers emerged. New York City became wealthy in the 1920s because many people began to invest in stocks and shares. Newbie investors and the general population invested in the stock market for the first time, thinking that it was a sure way to make money fast. Some even used money borrowed to invest because they were so confident that prices would continue to rise. However, the stock market continued to soar while the economy started to decline by the middle of the 1920s. Globally, trade came to a standstill because most nations were in a state of financial distress after World War I. Europe, which had been a major market for American products, could no longer afford to import as before. However, like Europe, the United States also had its issues after the war, even though it performed better than Europe. In the war, American farms had produced a lot more food than was required. When the war was over, there was less need for American crops, and farm incomes declined. Another issue was that America had expected many products during the war, but now it was difficult to find new markets for the products. As the number of countries importing American products reduced, the economy of the United States began to deteriorate. In short, while the early 1920s appeared to be a time of prosperity for New York and the United States, due to the stock market and economic growth, there were indications of problems. International commerce was declining, European markets were contracting, and American agriculture was ailing. These issues suggested tougher times ahead, despite the initial optimism. The mechanization of farms had placed many farmers in a position where they had to borrow money, and many farm laborers were put out of employment. Yields were at their highest, but the market was completely oversaturated at home, and there was no room for growth overseas. In this period, nearly 1/3 of Americans were still employed in agriculture, so the industry's failure would have dire implications. Some farmers were already in a position to pay their bills by the middle of the 20s. Awareness of this harsh truth was bound to dawn on Wall Street, and the markets became volatile as it was now clear that the share prices were inflated and had no substance. The economic growth that was evident due to stock market activities was actually a mirage. Wise investors started to short the market. Black Thursday occurred on October 24, 1929, when the stock market suffered a major crash. The markets were flooded with panic selling as investors dumped their stocks. In one day alone, a shocking 12.9 million shares were traded, which was the worst and most disastrous day in the history of share trading. When banks started collapsing and credit crunching, the economy came to a standstill. Companies could not carry out their operations without funds, and this resulted in more layoffs and increased unemployment. The effects of the Great Depression were felt across the country by 1932, with unemployment rates rising to the highest levels ever recorded. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, an important indicator of the stock market, reached its lowest level during this period of decline. The stock market crash of 1929 was a major event that occurred in the United States, and it led to a severe economic depression that affected the entire world. This event was the start of the Great Depression, an era of suffering and struggle for millions of people around the globe. Herbert Hoover became the President of America in 1929, when the American economy was already on the decline. However, Hoover failed to come up with adequate measures to address the situation, even after attempting to calm it down. He started measures like loans to key industries, but these were not sufficient to solve the problem of unemployment, which was ranging from 20 to 30% of the working population. Hoover's failure to arrest the economic downturn resulted in sustained criticism and condemnation for the crash. The effects of the Depression were not only limited to the United States, but affected other countries and worsened the situation in the global economy. Another example of protectionism during this period was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that was passed in 1930. Originally designed to protect the American industries from competition from overseas, the act led to the creation of a trade war. Other nations responded with their tariffs, which further limited the global commerce and exacerbated the economic downturn. During this period, the American dream was reduced to a mere existence as the economy deteriorated for most citizens. People had to stand in queues for bread, which was distributed as charity. Many others could not get jobs or feed their families, and thus became hobos, moving from one place to another in search of unemployment. In rural areas, farmers faced dire circumstances, as plummeting crop prices made it economically unfeasible to harvest, leaving fields littered with rotting produce. In cities across America, makeshift shanty towns emerged, housing displaced families and individuals in squalid conditions. These settlements, derisively named Hoovervilles after the beleaguered president, symbolized the widespread disillusionment and despair gripping the nation. In Germany, the crisis propelled the Nazis to power. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, with terrible ramifications for the German people and, eventually, the rest of the globe. In the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated in 1933 and remained in office until his death in 1945, thanks to the great series of crises with which he would deal. FDR would enact the New Deal, a large-scale economic recovery plan designed to rescue the economy. This complex, many-sided wave of legislation was designed to provide relief, reform, and recovery all at once. Another major component of the New Deal was the establishment of the Public Works Administration, which was meant to generate employment through the construction of various structures. During Roosevelt's presidency, many bridges, airports, schools, and other structures were built across the United States. The government even resorted to buying works of art from writers and artists to support their cause. Roosevelt would also move swiftly to help farmers, most of whom were now completely destitute. In the South, the Dust Bowl, which was a combination of drought and strong winds, worsened the situation of agricultural workers. The terrible conditions faced by the agricultural workers are one of the themes of one of the greatest works of literature to emerge from the Depression, The Grapes of Wrath. The Great Depression and Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency was the most transformative period in American history, characterized by the enactment of progressive but polarizing policies aimed at alleviating suffering and expanding the government's role in the lives of citizens. When Roosevelt took office in 1933, he immediately unveiled his first New Deal, a set of measures aimed at reversing the impact of the Depression. However, this initiative faced a lot of resistance, including from the Supreme Court. New Deal policies like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, to boost the farming industry, and the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, to establish industries and set decent working conditions were nullified by the judiciary. Unfazed by the backlash, Roosevelt introduced a second set of reforms between 1935 and 1936, which came to be referred to as the Second New Deal. This period was characterized by the enactment of important legislations, including the Wagner Act and the Social Security Act. The Wagner Act enhanced the rights of workers by enabling them to form unions and engage in collective bargaining, thus greatly supporting the labor movement. The Social Security Act was a landmark legislation in the United States, as it provided for Social Security in the form of unemployment compensation, pensions for the elderly, and aid for the crippled and the underprivileged. The progressive policies of Roosevelt were all received by the voters, and he was re-elected in 1936 with a large margin. However, historians continue to debate the success of Roosevelt's economic policies in general. Some people believe that the measures taken by Roosevelt were helpful in avoiding large-scale starvation and offering necessary support, while others believe that the measures were not enough to bring about an economic revival. At this time, Keynes, a leading economist of the time, came forward with the idea of more active government participation in the economy to increase well-being. The Keynesian economics that Roosevelt mostly embraced in his later years proposed that deficit spending and increased public investment could stimulate economic activity and minimize the effects of recessions. While debates about the New Deal success continue to this day, Roosevelt's administration revolutionized the American political and governmental landscape. His administration expanded the role of the federal government in addressing social and economic problems, thus paving the way for future reforms and shaping the direction of American liberalism for several decades. These economic theories are being discussed today, and economists are divided on how much intervention is needed or is desirable in a large-scale economic crisis. While by 1940 unemployment had fallen, it was still extremely high, and the Great Depression is still the longest-lasting economic depression in the industrialized world. Finally, the Second World War contributed to the conclusion of the Great Depression by providing a significant economic boost in the United States, beginning in 1941. There was no need to generate new jobs because everyone had either been recruited in the Army or was busy manufacturing guns or explosives. Many of Roosevelt's measures are still in place in the United States today to avoid the recklessness that led to the wild speculation of the 1920s from occurring again. The 1999 repeal of FDR's Glass-Steagall Act is frequently cited as a contributing factor to the 2008 financial crisis. Previously prohibited banking activity was unexpectedly reinstated for the first time since the 1920s. Commercial and investment banks amalgamated, resulting in severe effects for the world economy. The origins of the Depression and the reasons for its termination remain contested issues. Although comparable economic calamities have occurred since then, the Great Depression remains unrivaled in contemporary times. If you love this video, please like it and subscribe for more content like this.